guys, it's Laura from Lightning Cosplay. You may know that I'm a big Monsterhunter fan and I played a lot of Monsterhunter World and I already created the Rattian armor. But of course, that's not enough for me. I wanted to create another cosplay from Monsterhunter World, so I decided to make the bone armor set. Mostly because of the helmet, because the design looks so cool. So here we have my finished helmet and today I'm going to show you how I made it. I warn you, it's a long and sometimes quite complicated process, but I do my best to explain it to you, so let's go! As reference, I took some in-game screenshots from a lot of different angles. I took a photo of my head cast to find the right proportions and to check how the helmet fits best to my head. I printed it out to create a pattern out of cardboard. I will use this as guideline to get the right shape of the skull. Then I taped the cardboard pattern onto my head cast and began to build up the skull with aluminium foil. When you want to sculpt something with clay, it's always better to create a lightweight core, which you use as base for your sculpt. Otherwise, you would need way more clay and the sculpture would get super heavy and difficult to handle. As you can see, I just built a skull out of aluminium foil and a lot of hot glue. I did the same with the horns. This looks easier as it actually was. It took me some hours and was super frustrating, but at the end it turned out quite good. For sculpting the skull, I used Monster Clay Soft. This was my first time sculpting with Monster Clay and I really liked it. It's not that sticky like the other one I normally use. I heated up the clay and started to apply it all over the skull. And I did the same with the horns. But here I'm using my Chavant and SP clay in medium because I needed a harder clay for them. Later you'll see why. Here I already did a lot of sculpting on the skull and worked on some details. And now it was time to work on the horns. For that I removed them from the skull. This makes it a lot easier to work on them and it's also the reason why I took the harder clay. The details don't get destroyed while I'm working on them and turning them around and stuff like that. First, I gave them the right shape and smoothed out the surface. Then came the best part, sculpting the details. For shaping and smoothing out the surface, I like to use my fingers, and for the detail work, I prefer to use tools. The skull also needed some details and textures. Adding textures to your sculpt is super important and make them look so much more realistic. The teeth were also made with the same clay I used for the horns. The whole sculpting process took me about 4 days and I'm super happy how the skull, the horns and also the teeth turned out. But I was still not done yet. The jawbones were still missing. I also sculpted them with monster clay. Then it was finally time for molding. I started with the horns. I built clay walls to separate the two halves of the mold. Here I'm making the registration keys, which hold the two halves of the mold together. If you want to learn more about all the mold making stuff in detail, you can check out our mold making book. I highly recommend it. You can find the link to our shop in the video description. I made a brush-on silicone mold with Rebound 40 from Smooth On. Their brush-on silicones are the best. I applied several layers until the silicone was thick enough. To keep the silicone mold in shape, I made a Moldjacket out of epoxy resin and fiberglass. The grey layer you see here is EpoxaCoat from Smooth On. I always apply 1 or 2 layers of EpoxaCoat before I start with the fiberglass because it makes the inside of the mold cleaner and looks just much better. And here we already have the finished molds. For the horns I only made a fiberglass jacket for one half of the mold to save time and material. But this only works when the brush-on silicone mold is thick enough. I used Rebound 40, which is already quite stiff, and you have to apply enough layers. I used small clamps to hold both halves of the mold together. This is not the professional way, but in this case it works quite good. For the skull, I also made a brush on silicone mold. To get the silicone in the deeper areas, which are tricky to reach, I first turned the skull over and applied some layers of Rebound 25. Then I turned it back into the right position and applied more silicone on top. I wanted to make the mold out of Rebound 25 because it's softer than Rebound 40, but while I was working on the mold I realized I ran out of the 25, so I continued working with Rebound 40. The fiberglass shell needs to be separated in two parts. Instead of using clay to separate the two halves, I used aluminium foil and tape. This is a super fast and easy way. I started with a thick layer of EpoxaCoat. Then I applied the fiberglass mats with epoxy resin. I always do 3 or 4 layers to get a strong shell. After 24 hours the first half was fully cured and I could start to work on the other half. This is a release for epoxy resins, which I always use when I make my epoxy shells. It prevents both halves from sticking together. You can just apply it with a brush and wait until it's fully dry. And again the same process with this half of the mold. The fiberglass can have very sharp edges. I really recommend to sand them down, otherwise you will instant cut yourself while handling the mold. Before I could open the mold I had to clean up the seam line. I always make this with a Dremel, it works fine. Now I had to crack open the Moldjacket. I carefully started to open the seam with a slotted screwdriver and then added a popsicle stick. And then just repeated this process. And ta-da! Time to open the mold and remove the silicone from the clay skull. Don't worry when you destroy your clay master, you now have a mold. You can cast dozens of copies. One little thing was still missing. To hold both parts of the Moldjacket together, I added screws. Of course, I also made a mold for the teeth and the jaw pieces, but these are just simple block molds, nothing special to show. Now let's go on with the casting process. For hollow casts, I recommend using Smoothcast 65D from Smooth On. Well, I don't think I have to explain what I'm doing here. The only thing which is important that I only have about 2 minutes until the resin starts to cure. I repeated this 3 or 4 times until the resin was thick enough. Make sure you get an evenly thickness also at the edges. The best part, open the mold and see if the cast was a success. The horns were also hollow casted with Smoothcast 65D. Same process like before, but a bit more tricky because this time the mold was closed and I could not see what I was doing. For more stability, I filled the horns with an expanding foam. This is foam with 3, also from Smooth On. I just love their products and no, they don't pay me for that. And again, the best part, opening the mold. Two beautiful, super lightweight horns. This is a mold I made for the jaw pieces. I wanted to keep the helmet as lightweight as possible, so I took some foam clay which I had left from another project and thought, why not filling the mold with foam clay? And it worked out great! The teeth were also casted with Smoothcast 65D and I cleaned up the seams of the horns. And then I finally was done with the casting process. But before I could start painting everything, I glued on the teeth and worked on the attachment for the horns. Because I travel a lot with my costumes, I wanted to make them detachable. I have not much video footage of it, but later in the video we'll see how it works. It is basically just a simple plug-in system with magnets. And here it is. It took me 2 weeks until this point. Now just the paint job and the hair was missing. I gave the whole helmet a light sandy base color. As always, I used my beloved spray paints from Montana. The rest was just adding acrylic paint and wipe most of it away. I thinned down normal acrylic paint with water. You can also do this with oil paints. Just use whatever you have at home. You get the best effects by layering different techniques. Just use a brush, a sponge or a towel. Here you can get really creative. For the hair, I used some old wig leftovers. It's actually super easy. I just took a strand, teased the hell out of it, twisted it, and sealed the dread with a flat iron. I combined 2 wigs, one lighter and a darker red. I glued everything together with tons of hot glue, super professional, but nobody will see it later. And once again, teasing action. It had to be super fluffy. For better transportation, I made the hair part of the bag detachable with Velcro. Now just the last details were missing, the feathers and the red bands. I used different types and sizes of feathers to make it look more interesting like on the reference picture. And for transportation, I can now remove the hair. And also the horns. For more comfort while wearing it, I added some foam inside. The jawbones are attached with Warbler's pearl yard. And this is the final look. The helmet turned out heavier than expected, but it's super well balanced and fits perfectly on my head. I still haven't finished the rest of the cosplay, but I already had some photo shoots with the helmet. Even when it's actually from Monsterhunter, I think it fits good to all kinds of shaman and voodoo outfits. I'm so in love with this helmet, it turned out just perfect. I mean, look at it, it's just amazing. I know I've used a lot of different materials with weird names in this video, so I've put all the infos in the video description. Well then, I hope this video was helpful and you've learned something. I'm already working on my next full making of video, and if you don't want to miss that, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and then hopefully see you next time. Bye bye!